This is highlights from the judge's summary of Tommy Robinson's case against the Cambridgeshire Police for harassment and her findings at the end, followed by my own summary and thoughts on the whole thing. I'm just going to read the bits I've clipped out. It's about 5 or 6 minutes worth, and then I'll do my little spiel at the end of it all. I will say up front that I think she came to the right conclusion. I think she was fair. Yeah, I can feel the waves of hate rolling over me as I say that. So in anticipation of that, Tommy wasn't individually targeted here. He was targeted, but part of a much wider operation where everyone in the pub was targeted. It was a football match, it was being policed, and the police threw everybody out, along with Tommy, at a certain time. Probably incorrectly, but it was their call to make. So here we go. Proceedings have resumed at 3:09. She says Robinson travelled into Cambridge by train with his 3 children for the purpose of watching Luton Town FC playing Cambridge United. At 6:30 p.m. he was asked to leave the Grain and Hop Store pub. Mr. Lennon says this was harassment, breached his right to a family life and breached his rights to freedom of expression. Recapping evidence from police. Inspector Johnson said the risk of disorder was the highest due to the historical understanding of the 2 teams. The briefing given by Inspector Johnson heard that the match was given a C rating, the highest given that historical behaviour. Luton supporters were given a medium risk before and after the match. Supporters were told to move on by 6:30. It was Inspector Johnson that made the determination that Luton Town supporters had to drink up and leave at 6:30 p.m. If they didn't do so, they could be dispersed using a Section 35. Inspector Johnson said the need was to move on the supporters before they could consume more alcohol, which would cause the risk to increase. PC Mason said when he told them they had to go at 6:30 p.m. they were unhappy. She says the Luton supporters expressed a wish to stay and finish watching the football match on the TV in the pub. Judge satisfied that Robinson was a risk-based supporter. PC Mason said Mr. Lennon, or Yaks as he called him, didn't think he was a risk, but it was not his decision to make. Mr. Lennon's complaint was that he had done nothing wrong and that he didn't need to be moved on, that he was being singled out and moved on because of who he is. That is not, in my judgment, the case. Mr. Lennon is not as well known as he or his supporters might think. While Inspector Johnson knew who Mr. Lennon was from policing EDL marches and in the news, those are separate matters to the football match. The concern with respect to Mr. Lennon was heightened when he was in the pub alongside other risk supporters. Sergeant Street in the pub was acting on information he had received from the Luton supporters. Acting on that, his was a risk supporter with other risk supporters. I am satisfied that Mr. Lennon was a risk-based supporter and that evidence is supported by PC Mason. While he did not consider himself a risk, he was aware that Cambridge Police did think he was a risk. The events after Robinson left the pub. Mr. Lennon's views to whether or not he was properly treated is not the issue of this case. As the video footage shows, Mr. Lennon moved out onto Regent Terrace where his children were. As any good parent would, Mr. Lennon shielded his children from what was going on. He walked down Regent Terrace and was followed by uniformed police officers. One of them, PC Ruddy, had a handheld camera and thought that it might provide evidence to what happened. Quite simply, that video evidence did not exist. It was deleted soon after as it contained nothing of note. The uniformed officers were perfectly entitled to follow Mr. Lennon at that time. In my judgment, it was proper operational procedure to stop Mr. Lennon from re-entering the pub. Someone who's recorded was saying in front of the children, "It's a fucking joke, it's bollocks." And at some point Mr. Lennon, who was angry, turned around to police, told them, "You're upsetting the children." Mr. Lennon was getting upset and that was getting the children upset and was compounding the problem. Mr. Lennon's filming stopped at the end of Regent Terrace because his mobile phone ran out of power. The police evidence is that they stopped following as he was going towards the train station. There was no reason for the police to continue to follow him, and there is no evidence that they did follow him further. Judge responds to harassment and discrimination claims. Mr. Lennon claims his human rights have been infringed. The allegation that Cambridgeshire Police deliberately targeted him, in my judgment, must necessarily fail. In my judgment, there is no evidence that Mr. Lennon was being treated differently because of his beliefs on fundamental Islam. Mr. Lennon, when asked in cross-examination, accepted he was not being prevented from providing his views, no officer mentioned his views on Islam, and that there was no hint on that day about his views on Islam. Mr. Lennon, I think quite fairly, was endeavouring to make sense of what happened to him and the way it happened. That, in my judgment, does not go anywhere near his claim he was discriminated against. It may be Robinson and his followers think his views are greater to the community than they are. There is no evidence for the inequality claim and it fails. Mr. Lennon also alleges harassment. I cannot accept that the complaint made by Mr. Lennon, what happened on the 27th of August, satisfies that it was on 2 occasions. This was one event. It started upstairs of the pub and continued outside to the end of Regent Terrace. The police were ensuring he had left the premises and was on his way to the railway station. This is not an issue if this was 2 actions, but a statutory test on any normal pleading. Plainly, there are not 2 separate occasions. This claim for harassment, in my judgment, must fail. We carry on with her remarks. That leaves Mr. Lennon's claim that his right to a family life has been infringed. The EU Convention, Article 8, has been engaged with. Cambridge police deny there has been a violation. I am satisfied that another could reach the same conclusion, but that does not mean that everyone must reach the same conclusion. In this case, PC Mason may well have come to a different conclusion, but not everyone was required to come to the same one Sergeant Street did for it to be a reasonable one. PC Mason has told us he knew Mr. Lennon for 14 years and his decision would have been guided by this. She says that in her judgment this does not mean Sergeant Street was not acting lawfully. The evidence of the Luton Town spotter that Robinson was a risk and with other risk supporters, it is reliable information, it is relevant and not to be discounted. The landlady clearly intervened to say Mr. Lennon had been fine. That is evidence that is relevant. But it's not everything. She is referring to how they had been and not how he was going to be. He is seen in the video footage that he has been told twice by police from Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire that he must move on at 6:30 p.m. Police did act within accordance of the law. I am satisfied that the standard for reasonable suspicion is a low one, which basically means when you're dealing with football issues you act early rather than late, and that the factors could turn out to be wrong. A police officer is obliged to look at all matters cumulatively that provide the reasonable grounds to suspect and the necessity to give the Section 35 direction. In all circumstances, I find that Mr. Lennon has not made out his case on the grounds he has put forward. I appreciate it will be a disappointment to Mr. Lennon and those who share his viewpoints on these matters. He may well feel aggrieved, but my duty is consider the actions of the police were in accordance with the law. I find they did act within accordance of the law. I thought her observation about overestimating Tommy's support was invaluable, but not the way she meant it. That is not, in my judgment, the case. Mr. Lennon is not as well known as he or his supporters might think. I think it's probably the case that people who live in what you might loosely call Tommy communities have the very misleading impression that support for Tommy Robinson is like 100% across the country. This is a long way from the truth. His support is marginal at best. Obviously it's growing, obviously the trajectory is only one way, i.e. upwards, but his support across the country is still only marginal. And the more people live in a kind of hinterland of right-wing conspiracy theories and bullshit about everyone supporting Tommy Robinson, the more nothing will ever be done to increase that. The more people actually accept the reality that his support is basically increasing all the time, but still marginal, the more those people will actually be inclined to do something to change that, whatever that might be. YouTube channels, for example, but whatever, accept the reality of the marginality of his support, and that will be the way to address the situation and increase his support. In terms of her findings, I accept them, I agree with her. I can feel the waves of hatred as I say that. Tommy is inclined to be economical with the truth, by which I don't mean he lies. When people say that, economical with the truth, they usually mean somebody's lying. What I mean is simply, literally, he can be economical, he doesn't say things. And there were big information gaps in what he released on his videos prior to these transcripts emerging. We didn't know, like I said in the previous video, we didn't know that this was a football match. which it was. It was a Luton away game, and this pub seemed to be the centre of it. They were playing, they were showing it, broadcasting the match, and it was full of supporters, I suppose, from both sides. So the police were there for a reason. The police didn't just descend on the place, they were there for the reason of policing it, for watching out for trouble. And also this Section 35 dispersion order, or whatever, timed to kick in 30 minutes before the game ended. This was the most retarded imaginable possible timing of this thing. Obviously it was provocative, and I think intentionally so. Do it at half time. Hell, it would be better to kick everyone out the pub before the game even starts. Give them a chance to go somewhere else, rather than heaving them out there at a point where they're not going to be in a position to see the end of the match. It could not have been timed more provocatively, that dispersal order. Couldn't have been done worse, and I think willfully provocatively so. However, that said, it applied to everyone. It didn't just apply to Tommy. Everyone else in the pub, I would imagine, was behaving themselves. Everyone else would have been entitled to have the same complaint, that we're not doing anything wrong, why do we have to go? Anyone could have complained. This wasn't just down to Tommy. He had to go. He was told to get out because he was on the risk list on the basis of his past form, and that's kind of understandable. So he wasn't being targeted. There wasn't a police operation descending on him, and he wasn't being specifically singled out here. It was because he was a Luton supporter and he was on the risk list, albeit in a historical context. He was still there, and this was entirely absent from the videos he released, and is very relevant contextual information. The cop who spoke up for him, it seemed to me that the evidence he gave that Tommy wasn't a risk. This was radically undermining the testimony of the police who said it was a risk. The judge's position was, yeah, that's as may be. However, it wasn't PC Mason's call to make, it was this other bloke's call to make. He made a different call, he was entitled to do it, and it was procedurally appropriate what he did, which I think is fair enough. Tommy apparently was saying that it was because of his attitude to his beliefs on Islam that he was being targeted. I cannot see how you could ever make that stick. You'd need one of the police officers to come out and say, it's because of Islam we're doing this. I can't imagine any other way you could have evidence that it was because of his religious beliefs. So I can't see how they would ever have expected that to stick. What she said about harassment, I said in the previous video, this seemed to me a technicality. It's only harassment, apparently, I don't know, I have to rely on the judge for this, it's only harassment when it's more than one episode. It's two or more. If it's one, it's not harassment. I thought that if two such of this kind would be harassment, then surely they'd find a way to call the one episode that we had something which isn't harassment but would be punishable. But she stuck to the line that it wasn't harassment, so because on the technicality that it was only one event, so nothing to see here. Seems to me a technicality, but at the same time, evidently she's correct. Why didn't the lawyer know this? Why would they put a charge of harassment, which they would know couldn't possibly stick? Why would they even go for that if, technically speaking, it could never stick? I do not understand why they went for that to begin with. But fair play, if it's not harassment, albeit on a technicality, it's not harassment. What are you going to do about that? There were a couple of things which she said which I wasn't totally happy with. The thing with the manager who spoke up for Tommy. The landlady clearly intervened to say Mr. Lennon had been fine. That is evidence, that is relevant, but it's not everything. She is referring to how they had been and not how he was going to be. That seems to me to be squeezing your way through to a dismissal of her testimony where it might have been worth a second look, but at the end of the day it was her call to make. Then there was the question of the deleted video. PC Ruddy had a handheld camera and thought that it might provide evidence to what happened. Quite simply, that video evidence did not exist. It was deleted soon after as it contained nothing of note. That was her call to make. She didn't think there was anything film-worthy at that point, so the fact that it was deleted was inconsequential to her. At the end of the day, it was her call. If it had been me, in retrospect, I think I'd have said, dude, take the money. I don't think this was worth really bringing to court. And I'm sure his lawyers advised him accordingly, and he wanted to make a point. He wanted to try and get them to apologise, which is fair enough. And it's going to cost him, what, $38,000? He's going to buy himself some good exposure as a consequence, and let's face it, his core fans aren't going to give a stuff about what I say about it. They're going to consider it more persecution, which on this occasion I don't think it is, but he's been subject to plenty, and there's plenty more coming down the pipeline. So fair enough. Fair play to him, if he was happy to take the risk. But I don't think this was worth bringing to court, which is not to say the fact that I say he should have taken the money isn't to say that I think you shouldn't contribute to his court costs. I think you definitely should contribute, and I will be contributing something myself, even if I think it was an unwise decision, or not the best decision to bring it to court. They seem to have lodged an appeal. I would imagine that's purely as a technicality. I can't imagine what it is they want to appeal. I don't think, as far as my inexpert knowledge goes, anything has been incorrectly applied here. The law has been correctly applied. And there's going to be no new evidence coming out about this. There could be no other grounds for appeal. You can't appeal just because you don't like the result. So I think that's not going to happen. I think this is the last we've heard of this, and probably for the best. Yeah, it's good exposure for him, obviously. If a little bit costly, there's going to be a hell of a lot more exposure coming down the line with his contempt case when that finally gets going, if they manage to get the charges together in a way that they think makes them look least possible corrupt, which is going to be an ask. It's going to go ahead. That's going to skyrocket his profile again, and it's going to give me the opportunity again to destroy the whole thing. So what's not to love? But for what it's worth, I think the judge made the right call on this occasion. So I'm sorry if you don't agree, but there you go.